if you got your Bibles with you, and I hope you do, turn over to 2 Thessalonians. We're going to be looking in chapter 2, specifically at verses 9 through 12. We're finishing up looking at this section, which is apocalyptic in nature, where you see things like the son of lawlessness, the son of destruction, where the appearance of this coming one, this lawless person who comes by the activity of Satan. And so there's a lot of neat things from a textual standpoint that are going on. But I think when we read through this, there are some things that we can take away from it practically and apply them to our lives and help us to live a more faithful life today and figure out how we can serve God better, how we can serve God more spiritually today. When you read through this section, which we're about to do, there is somebody who plays a pretty prominent role, and it's not God. So listen as we read through 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 through 12. The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false signs and wonders, with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Satan and his demons are active in the world, even today, and we need God's help to fight against them. Now, unfortunately, what has happened is throughout time and through our culture, Satan has been kind of morphed, changed, to the point where some people view him, as you might see in this picture, where he is almost an anti-God. And if you were a betting person and you were going to guess who's going to win just based on the picture, my money's on the Rip dude. He just looks like he's going to win the arm wrestling competition. What we've done is we have made Satan in our minds, in our images, in our culture to be equal to God, but just bad. And that's not at all the way the Bible presents him. In fact, our culture has some other depictions of Satan that aren't correct either. Sometimes we present him as a cute little imp who runs around and accidentally causes people to do bad things. We also have, as we talked about earlier, Gary Larson, who presents figuratively in the far side these images of Satan and of hell that are nothing close to the biblical picture. This is one of my son's favorite comics from the far side. So you've got this guy who's whistling in the inferno, and one demon says to the other, we're just not reaching that guy. That's not what that place is like. It's not a place where the demons and Satan reign. It's not a place where Satan rules. In Matthew chapter 25, Jesus makes it very clear that hell was prepared for Satan and his angels. They're going there to be punished. He's not going there to rule over anything. He is going there to suffer perdition and condemnation. And when you read through the biblical picture, it is a place where nobody wants to go, in particular, him. And he is going there into the pit, into the abyss, into a lake that burns with sulfur and brimstone, where the fire is not quenched, where the worm is never satisfied, where there's weeping and outer darkness and gnashing of teeth, and the smoke rises up from that destruction forever. That's where he's going. Not the place that you see depicted in television shows and in comic strips. And so what happens is, because of the way, I think, Satan gets portrayed in our culture, we tend to not view him in a serious manner. But when you look at the text that we've read, there are some words and phrases that are very important that help us to see and understand just how powerful he is. With the caveat and with the understanding that if Satan and God were to arm wrestle, it would be like arm wrestling a toddler. It doesn't matter how strong the 2-year-old is. You are going to win. So when you look through this passage, there are these phrases, the activity of Satan. So he's out, he's active, he's doing something. He has power, he has signs, he has wonders, he is deceptive. And so there's this deluding influence that comes. And people, because of what Satan does, what Satan is allowed to do, people will be condemned because they have pleasure in unrighteousness. And so when we begin looking at this passage, we cannot dismiss the fact that Satan is active. And the view of him throughout the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, is not of this being who is equal to God, but a being who is submissive to God, yet working against the Lord. And in Job, you see him going from place to place and coming before God in a council. And all throughout the New Testament, Jesus talks about Satan as though he is a real being. But we tend to dismiss the supernatural or the spiritual. Why do we do that? I think part of the reason is because nobody wants to believe in that little imp. Nobody wants to believe in that Gary Larson version. And nobody wants to believe that there is an evil being equally as powerful as God. And so the options that our culture presents to us are ridiculous. And they're easy to dismiss. And it makes it seem like if you actually believe in supernatural things, that you must not be a rational person. And so because we want to appear rational, we don't want to be foolish, we don't want to have people think that we're naive, so we tend to dismiss spiritual and supernatural things. And we add on top of that the fact that you can't see them, it makes it even easier to dismiss. The number one proof that I have right now that there isn't a giant pink invisible unicorn floating above my wife's head is that I can't see the giant pink invisible unicorn. It would be really cool if it was there. But there's no evidence for it. I can't see it, I can't taste it, can't touch it. I can't see, taste, or touch Satan either. And so the same cognitive process, the same senses that allow me to dismiss mythical things like a unicorn could also be used to dismiss things like Satan or angels or demons. And so we don't want to appear foolish. And from an atheistic perspective, to say that you believe in these supernatural beings, well, you might as well believe in the pink invisible unicorn. And we don't want to be lauded in with that type of thinking. So we tend to dismiss it. But the Bible says that supernatural and spiritual beings exist. It says that they're real, that they're active, that they have power, that they interact with the physical creation, with our experiences. It doesn't necessarily say that they're always able to take people over, although you clearly see that in the New Testament, with Jesus driving demons out of people. But it does say that they are active. There is this retribution, this final day of judgment that will come upon these real spiritual beings who have been disobedient to God. Satan is as real as any of the angels, mentioned in Job chapter 1, where he comes before God with all the rest of the sons of God and gives an account for his activities. Satan is active in the life of Jesus, tempting him in Matthew chapter 4. Jesus actually has a discussion with Satan. Paul clearly warns the Thessalonians that Satan is powerful and active. Peter warns Christians in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8 that Satan is prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking people to devour. Mythical creatures can't do that. But real spiritual beings can. Well, when we get to our text and we look in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 9, it says, "The coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan." The word activity there is a word that you're familiar with, whether you speak Greek or not. It's the word energia, which is energy. And that's where we get our word energy from. So the coming of the lawless one, all the stuff that we talked about previously, all of these things, and the stuff that's coming up throughout this section, is coming by the energy of Satan. This refers, as you might guess from our English word, to the ability to do work. Satan is able to do work. He is able to bring about things. We see God's energy. We see God's activity. In the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the Apostle Paul will use that same word in Ephesians chapter 1 to talk about how God's energy is there when he raises Jesus from the dead. Satan isn't just present. He's not just around. He's working and able to accomplish things. There's no biblical indication that that has ever changed. And so our adversary is not somebody who used to be active, but now he's on vacation. Our adversary is somebody who is still active, who is still powerful, who still has energy to bring about the destruction that this passage talks about. It is clear from this passage and other places that Satan has great influence in the world. In Luke chapter 4, when Satan is tempting Jesus, he takes Jesus up and he shows him all the kingdoms of the world in an instant. And he says, these are mine. And I have authority to give them to whomever I wish. Worship me, and I will give them to you. Now, when you consider the fact that Jesus had come to establish a kingdom, and Satan is offering him authority and power over all the kingdoms, this was an opportunity for Jesus to force his will onto all people. That's a pretty significant temptation. But here Satan has the authority and he has the power to give rule, to exercise authority in these kingdoms to whomever he chooses. And so when we see governments active and working in the world, there is possibility. It's not always a certainty, but there is a possibility that that is the working or the energy or the activity of the evil one in play. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, we're going to read that. In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might, and put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Which really isn't that big of a deal, because he doesn't do much. That's not at all the picture. In verse 12 it says, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God. Why do you need the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation, the shield of faith? Why do you need those things? Because your enemy is real. Your enemy is present. Your enemy is active. If he were gone, you don't need the panoply of God. If he weren't fighting, you don't need your shield or your sword. We are not at peace. We are at war. And we are at war with an adversary who seeks your destruction. And if you do not take up the armor of God, if you do not stand firm in the fight, then you will be destroyed. So we have to do that. This is a very powerful being. And Jesus, referring to him, would even call Satan the ruler of this world. Ultimately, that power and authority will be taken away from him, and he will be subjected to judgment. But while things yet exist, we have a powerful enemy with energy and activity who is in our universe seeking our destruction. So not only does he come with energy, activity, but he also has power. The word over in 2 Thessalonians, when it talks about the power that Satan has, where Satan comes with all power. He comes with all power. This is the exact same word that is used to talk about how God saves people. When you go over to Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, it says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation. That word power that is used to talk about how God works mightily to save, dunamis, it's the Greek word. It's where we get dynamite from. Lots of power. Satan's energy, Satan's activity is able and capable. It has the capacity to bring about utter destruction and ruin. And as God is working to save people, Satan is working to destroy. And he has the ability. He does not compare to God's power. Remember, it's like a full-grown man arm wrestling a toddler. But he still has power. And he can destroy. And he can deceive. And he can overcome. We have to never foolishly underestimate the destructive power of the evil one. He, Satan, is able to array the Gentile nations along with the Jews against the Son of God. If he could bring about the death of Jesus on the cross, which I think the Bible makes it clear that he did, and what power or might do I have against him? The answer is none. The thing that I have to fight against with Satan is what God gives me. The armor of God. It's interesting when you go back to that passage in Ephesians, it doesn't say put on the armor of Stephen. It says put on God's armor. This is what God gives you. And over in James, it doesn't say stand up and be firm and the devil will run away from you. It says, draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. And then the devil runs away. The devil's scared of God. And so our duty is to be faithful to the Lord, to draw near to the Lord, and then the real power can push the toddler away. It's interesting that when you have a bunch of little ones, you can see that. I actually did arm wrestle Lily, just to see what it would be like to arm wrestle a toddler in preparation for talking to y'all today. Karen left me home with the kids for a little while. So Lily and I were at the table, and we sat down, and I got her to sit in her little high chair, and I had to give her some chocolate milk, and she's sitting there drinking her milk. All right, let's arm wrestle. And she goes, okay. And she put her arm out, ready, go. And so I took one finger, and I just pushed her arm down. I said, I win. And she goes, okay. And then she got down and went on playing. It was easy. It was easy to beat the toddler. That toddler can pick up the infant. And that toddler, in a very short period of time, can really, really, really hurt the infant. God is the parent. Satan is the toddler. We are the infant. The toddler can really, really hurt us. So we need to make sure that we stay close to Dad, that we stay close to our Father, to God, and He will protect us from the toddler. So yeah, the toddler does have power, and he has, from an earthly perspective, all kinds of power, but from a spiritual perspective, not so much. So we have to make sure that we are staying close to God, because our enemy does have the ability to fight against us. And he does this not only with power, but with these things that are false signs. False signs. Sometimes Satan does things or works things, and it seems legitimate. You remember when Jesus is around, the Pharisees are always coming to him, the religious leaders, they're always asking him, what sign do you do to prove what you're saying? That's a legitimate question. And you can see in the law where it says that if prophets come and they say something and it doesn't come to pass, don't listen to them. And so when they come and they ask Jesus, what signs do you do? That's a legally valid question. The problem is that Jesus has already done lots of signs to prove what he was saying. And the prophets backed up what Jesus was doing. So these people weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in looking for a way to justify what they already believed. It is amazing how easy it is to find what psychologists call your fake because. If you already believe something, you will take nearly anything as evidence that you are correct. Nearly anything. Mark Twain said something like, it's not nearly as difficult to fool somebody as it is to convince them that they've been fooled. Because once we decide to believe something, we want to be right. Don't you like to be right? I like to be right. And so our bias is to find things that back up what we already believe. And so what is happening here is Satan is able to offer things to people, false signs, that allow them to believe something. You may even hear people say something like, well, I prayed for a sign, and the next day there was a rainbow, and I just knew. I just knew that what I was doing was right, because there was a rainbow. Actually, there are probably several people here who can tell you the physical reason why you saw a rainbow, and it really had nothing to do with you being right or wrong. It had to do with the way that light was refracted through water particles in the sky. I know that really destroys the magic of rainbows. I think my childhood ended the day that I figured out mathematically how rainbows occur. And there's never a pot of gold at the end. But the fact that you saw a rainbow in no way validates anything that you are doing or believing. All it does is validate a promise that God made a really, really long time ago, that he will never flood the earth again. That's what it validates. But that's not how we operate. We go and we look for signs all the time. We ask for things. Well, if this happens and this happens and this happens, then I'll take that as a sign that I'm doing the right thing. Well, listen, if you were Satan and you were wicked and dastardly, like Wile E. Coyote, and you were looking for ways to trick people, and you have this roadrunner walking around saying, if I find the birdseed, I'll eat it, what would you do? I would put the birdseed out right underneath the giant 100-ton anvil. And when the bird came, I would just cut the rope. That's what Satan does, except his plans work out sometimes, unlike our poor coyote friend. And so what we see is that if you are going around saying, I just need a sign so I know that I'm right, and you happen to be wrong, guess what the deceiver will provide you with? A fake cause. He will give you something to justify what you already believe. Because he's powerful. And he's active. And he is looking to destroy. We never have to we cannot foolishly use things that the Bible never offers as evidence. Many groups today, many people today, depend upon these false signs for the foundation of their existence. I had somebody one time come and tell me that they were teaching me some outrageously ridiculous things. Part of which is that I could become a god and have my own planet and father spirit babies with thousands of wives, which I guess sounds good if you're a guy. But part of this process was that to prove that one day I could become a god, just like the God in the Bible, and have my own planet with people that I save or condemn to hell, the proof for this was that if I would just pray with them, I would feel a warmness inside. And that warm, fuzzy feeling is proof that one day you'll be a god. It sounds more like heartburn than anything to do with becoming a god. But that is the type of evidence that people search for, that people offer for what they believe. And that is the activity and power of the deceiver, of the evil one, of the adversary. Satan's attacks also come with wonders. Now, the word wonder is the biblical word that is used to talk about when we say miracle. It's the word wonder that is used. This word wonder is interesting. God's definition of miracle, of wonder, is not necessarily the same as our definition of miracle. When you go to the dictionary and you look up the word miracle, it says something that doesn't happen by natural means. Well, then that would mean that your salvation is miraculous. No part of your eternal salvation is natural in origin. It's all supernatural. But is your salvation, biblically speaking, a wonder? No. So when the Bible uses the word wonder, it uses it in a very special way. A wonder is how God makes himself manifest in the world. How God shows people that, hey, here I am. In ancient Israel, when you had the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, that was a wonder. Where is God? I wonder where. Oh, he's in the pillar of fire, in the pillar of cloud, leading us and sitting in the temple. God would do things like part the Red Sea to show that he is leading Israel into salvation. There's all sorts of things that happen throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, that are called wonders. They are evidence or manifestations of this being who loves you and cares for you. Well, the Apostle Paul says that Satan can deceive us by even making himself appear as an angel of light. And here it says that he is able to perform false signs and wonders. Are they wonders like God, where God parts the Red Sea? No, I don't think God would let Satan do that. But do things happen that people say, wow, this is a miracle. It's God, for sure. I'll give you an example of what I think a false wonder is. And I'm sure that these things have existed throughout time. You may remember that several years ago, there was a grilled cheese sandwich. And on this grilled cheese sandwich there are actually two sandwiches. One had the face of Mary. And there was another sandwich that had a bite out of it already that had the face of Jesus. When I looked at these sandwiches, I saw grilled cheese. But people looked at these sandwiches and they saw Mary and they saw Jesus. Clearly, this is a miracle. God is here in these sandwiches, and the people who have them must be right with God. We should listen to what they say. There have been statues throughout time that bleed because red water comes out of them or runs down them. Funny thing about water with high iron content, it's red. And so these statues in places where water has a high iron content and it runs down and gets oxidation particles in it, it stains the statue with red. It's red because there's ferrous oxide in it, not because it's blood. It's a wonder, right? So those are the types of things that I think are being talked about. Things that people will take as some kind of sign that God is here and active. And if you were Satan, and people were looking for that stuff, what would you do? I'd give it to them. I'd give it to them left and right. I'd give them 2 sandwiches. In fact, I think Satan missed out. I would have 1,000 sandwiches. Start a factory that produces these miraculous sandwiches. I mean, he had it going. Why did he quit? If you're looking for this stuff, he will use it to deceive you. He's not stupid. Compared to God, he is a toddler, but he's a really, really smart toddler. And he will deceive you. And he will attempt to destroy you. And so what we see is that God uses Satan to send a delusion. You see, the greatest thing that I think in the Bible that shows that God is all-powerful is that God is able to use this malevolent, hate-filled, wicked, terrible being to achieve his ends. Why did Satan send Jesus to the cross? Because Satan thought he would win. He thought this was game over. Here God sends his son to these people, these Israelites. I'll get them to kill him. How's them apples? And in getting Israel to kill Jesus, he actually does what God had been planning to do all along. And so the greatest weapon that Satan has, which is death, God uses to bring about the greatest result, which is life. And so God played Satan and used the evil and wicked intention of this being to bring about his glory. So how in this passage, when it says God sends a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth but have pleasure in unrighteousness, how does this work out? Well, what you see here is it's very important in verse 11. There's that word, it's therefore. This therefore word is a concluding statement. In other words, this is the conclusion of everything up to this point. All of the talk about the lawless one, about the son of destruction, about the coming of the Lord and the gathering together of the people. Therefore, this is the conclusion. The Thessalonians are suffering persecution at the hands of the Hebrews, of the Jews in the first century. Therefore, God sends a delusion so that there's this distinction that is made. Well, what's taking place? The Bible talks about everything or things being done by God sometimes that God isn't necessarily the one doing it. Right? When angels come and speak, we say, well, God spoke. When an angel shows up in the burning bush, we say, well, God was there. When an angel wrestles with Jacob, we say, well, God was there. And the Bible talks about it in both terms, in both ways. And so what we see is that when the Bible says here that God sends a strong delusion, there's no question that a strong delusion is coming. The question is, how is it coming? Has God handpicked these people and said, they will not believe because I hate them? Well, that doesn't mesh with things like John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Or 1 Timothy chapter 2, where it says that God desires that everyone would come to a knowledge of the truth and be saved. So what's going on here? Well, there are people, when you read through this passage, it says that they rejected the truth. They're condemned because they did not believe the truth. It's these people that are being sent the delusion. It's these people that are allowed to believe something that isn't true, that will pull them further away from the truth. We've talked before about the historical things going on here in the first century. It's almost impossible to tell the difference between Christians and Jews. It's almost impossible. So when Satan comes, and he's persecuting the Christians here in Thessalonica, he's causing all sorts of bad things to happen, what does God allow? What does God do? Well, these Jewish people who have rejected Jesus, they've rejected the gospel, and now they're persecuting his children, God lets them go. And you can see in passages like Romans chapter 1, it says, therefore God gave them up, and the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies amongst themselves. In fact, in Romans chapter 1, it says 3 times God gave them up. He let them go. So here what I think you're seeing is God is using this delusion to make a clear distinction between the Christians and the Jews who don't believe in Jesus. There are Jews who do believe, and there are Jews who don't. And God is making the distinction between these two groups even more powerful, even more definite, even more articulated and defined, so that when judgment comes, it is clear who was right all along. I think that's what's being described here. These Thessalonians are going through persecution so that when Jerusalem is destroyed, when the physical nation of Israel is undone, when it's very clear that this Old Testament law, all the temple, the worship, the sacrifices, all of that is gone, now it's very clear who was right, who was vindicated. So God again is using Satan's attempt to destroy Christianity to make it plain and clear who is right and who is wrong. And so that ultimately, I think, is how these people become deluded. This deception, the word there that should be used is pleasure. God sends a strong delusion, a deception. It's this wicked deception in verse 10. With all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth. That word deception actually means pleasure. Wicked pleasure. People are deceived because they look for ultimate fulfillment in this life. In Philippians 3, the Apostle Paul said, there are many who, I tell you with tears, are enemies of the cross of Christ. Their God is their belly. Their end is destruction. If you look for ultimate fulfillment in this life, guess who will give it to you? Satan. If you look for goodness, for pleasure, for what you desire as the ultimate end, then Satan will help you do that. He will help you find this temporary, fleeting good. People are deceived because they love pleasure. People are deceived because they want to determine what is good and what is right and what is true. Satan will do that. The world, Satan peddles pleasure keep you from paradise. The great trick in the garden is that Satan steals people away using the good things that God has made. What Adam and Eve failed to realize is that they had fellowship with God. They were already made in God's image. They are already like God. But Satan lies and promises them sin can make them better. He warps, and he twists, and he destroys, and he makes it seem like there's a better way than God's way. That is a lie. And using God's very own creation, using the very emotions and the desires that God has created in us, he destroys us and draws us away. But what can we do? Well, we have to remember that we've already won. The arm wrestling match is between an adult and a toddler. God is going to win. So even though life gets difficult, and I would never make light of the difficulty that we suffer or the heartache that we go through, because when sin came into the world, terrible, awful, horrible things came with it. But the promise is that if you endure to the end, if you suffer through the arm wrestling match, your team wins. I would always be hesitant, because I love history, to enter into a conflict that I didn't know I was going to win. When World War II came around, if I were in charge, I'd be like, well, it'd probably be a good idea to fight, but the Nazis might win. But if you knew going into it, which nobody did, if you knew going into it that you were going to win, I would be much more willing to fight. And the great thing about history is that you already know the end before you begin the event. And so I can look back and can say, oh yeah, I would have enlisted. I would have fought and I would have done this and it would have been great and there would be victory parades and ticker tape and sailors kissing women in New York and it would be awesome. Well, I know that because I know the victory already happens. I saw the picture of the sailor kissing the girl in New York. But nobody knew that in 1941. We get to see the end before the battle is over. We get to see the results before the conflict is finished. We win. So stick it out. Remember that we have the victory already. Don't give in. And that in the course of this, even though we have to deal with terrible things, God gives us what is best. God gave Adam and Eve what was best in the garden. And when they didn't listen, bad things happened. God gives you the best. When God tells us how to live, it's already the best. There's not another way that's better. We have to remember that God shows us the way we should go. He shows us how to live. He sent his son Jesus, who is righteous and holy in every way. And we're to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. We're to follow in the footsteps of people like Abraham in Romans chapter 4. The footsteps of faith. God shows us and teaches us the way. And it won't always be easy. It won't always be simple. But it will always be right. And that is what our hope is in. And that following God, it is always the right way to go because God is trustworthy. Satan is a liar and a deceiver, and you cannot trust him. You cannot trust what the world says is beautiful. You cannot trust what the world says is good, but you can always trust God. And ultimately, to these Thessalonians in the first century, the message that they are getting here about the lawless one coming and all of this destruction and the working of Satan is ultimately that God's salvation is coming. And the difficulty in waiting is that it requires faith in somebody besides ourselves. I want God to operate on my time here. I want him to do things when I want him to. But faith requires waiting for God to act when he is ready. And so when we read through this and we look at this, sometimes we get caught up in the details of who is this son of destruction and when is this happening and when is that happening. And really, that misses the message for us nearly all the way. The ultimate message here is to wait for the salvation of the Lord. God has everything under control. And there is nothing that is happening that he doesn't know about. There is nothing that is happening that he hasn't planned for. There is nothing that is happening that he isn't capable of getting you through. If Paul were writing in modern English vernacular, he would probably say something like, "It's okay. We've got this. We can do it. We already have the victory in Jesus. Just trust in what God has freely given." So as we go through life and you see somebody struggling with something, this is a passage where you can go and say, look, Satan is active. He is trying to hurt you. It's not always easy. It's not always simple. But we can stand against the fiery darts of the evil one because God has given us victory. If you're here this morning and you need help with anything, that's why we're here. To encourage one another with words like these from 2 Thessalonians. To remind us that we have a victory in Christ. And we are waiting for the return of our Savior, the Lord Jesus, from heaven, where our citizenship is.